Hello and welcome to this new podcast of the American Journal of Public Health. My co-host, Vickie Mays. Hello, Vickie. How are you doing today?
Very well.
Okay, great. And I are organizing a second podcast on the public health dimension of voting rights. We would like to know why are voting rights considered as political determinants of health. And that's a whole conversation. It's maybe the theoretical side of what we discussed with Dr. Rushovich and Professor Rhodes. But we also like to understand the mechanism, by which a political characteristic of a state, like the extent of voting rights, can impact the actual health of the population that lives in that state and which communities are more affected. All right, so in order to address those questions, we have three panelists. The first one is Jennifer Pomeranz. So Jennifer, just let us know your current position.
Thank you. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Public Health Policy and Management at the NYU School of Global Public Health.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Our second guest is Anna Hing. Hello, Anna.
Hello, Alfredo. Thank you for having me today.
It's our pleasure. Can you just introduce yourself briefly for our listeners?
So my name is Anna Hing. I'm a research scientist with the Center for Anti-Racism Research for Health Equity at the University of Minnesota, and I also work in the Health Policy and Management Department there.
Thank you, Anna. And then we have Marian Moser Jones. So I know at least that Marian Moser Jones is the history editor of the American Journal of Public Health. Just tell us a little bit more about your day job, I would say.
So I'm an associate professor in health services policy and management at The Ohio State University and an associate professor in the history department here at Ohio State.
My first question to you is, why do you call, and I think all of you do so, and if I'm wrong, you will tell us, why do you call something like voting rights a political determinant of health?
I think one key aspect of voting is that you can engage in community self-determination and actually elect officials that reflect the community's values, the community's needs, and can actually act on the community's behalf. If you're only being represented by elected officials that are elected at a higher level of government, or that a group that doesn't represent the community votes in, then really those needs and values are not going to be reflected in the laws that happen in that location.
Got you. Is having a voice at the table, being able to influence the law.
So if you look at Healthy People 2030, you look at this pie graph of the social determinants of health. And without further context, it's misleading. One of the slices of the pie is dollars, and another is housing, and another is education. And all of those things, the other is access to healthcare. All of those things are determined by decisions, collective decisions at the local, state, and federal level by elected representatives and then the heads of agencies that they appoint. So it's very clear that politics is going to determine who has more money, who has more access to healthcare, who has more access to education, etc. And I think it's really, really important to understand that, because the social determinants of health, for someone who's just learning about them in this way, and when they're represented as this static pie graph, can think that, it's just the way it is. Some people have more money than others. Some people have more access to healthcare. Some people have better housing. And in fact, all of those imbalances, inequities, differences are the result of political decision-making over years, decades, and centuries.
I love that framing. That's a great way to put it.
Yes. And I think to add to that, like when we think about what our goal is in public health of moving towards health equity and conducting those interventions on housing, on education, and those things, if we're only looking at it from a perspective of considering the social determinants without thinking about what is then even further upstream from that, which is voting and how power is distributed across our society, those interventions will always fall short because we're not giving people the ability to advocate for themselves and to enact those things that they know will make their lives better and healthier. And so by bringing voting into that, we're really trying to think about those power inequities as well and how that's tied to the political, and then how the political is tied to all those known social determinants that Marian just mentioned.
We think of voting in the narrow sense, and it's often because we're always caught in the current election cycle, and we think, well, how much difference will it make? Will this one vote make? Now, sometimes it's obvious. As here in Ohio, we just voted in an off-year election on constitutional abortion rights and on marijuana legalization. So that's obvious, but a lot of times it's not obvious. And I'd encourage us to think in the longer term. So when people have access to the ballot and also to see the impacts of their voting at different levels over the longer period, that makes a difference.
I think what you just brought up is a really important point that is highly missed is actually the judiciary. When people vote for president, they think it's just for president. And the president is the one who appoints who's going to be on the Supreme Court. And as we've seen over the last few years, they fundamentally shifted the entire state of the Constitution of America. There's a new interpretation for gun rights, for abortion, many aspects. We're maybe going to lose deference to agencies' own thoughts about their power and decision making under what's called the Chevron doctrine. So the one thing that is so overlooked is the appointment of judges, which changes the entire trajectory of the country and for decades, not just when a new law is passed.
Often when there are major changes that we want to see in society, individuals feel very powerless. But there's been a real history with voting of people understanding their vote matters. And so when you talk about this from the perspective of health, it's one of the ways that one can actually deal with the legacy of inequity. It allows a person to become engaged. So there's a lot to be said about voting. And it's, there is associated with voting for some populations, generational trauma, and actually feeling responsible for moving ahead and using the vote is a way of, contributing to a legacy, and that is to change the past.
Absolutely. And indeed, I would like you to explain to our listeners what has changed over the last 10 years, because before that, state who wanted to restrict voting right had to get a kind of clearance from the federal level. Now, they don't anymore. So what happened, and which communities have been most affected?
I think actually one of the worst laws, there's major redistricting going on in favor of the incumbents, which is terrible. And then the other one that targets indigenous populations specifically is to restrict the ability to use P.O. boxes for both for your ID, for your registration, for voting, and indigenous populations that live on tribal lands don't have residential mailing addresses that the states recognize for voting, which completely disenfranchises enormous populations in these states. And those two have been very influential in restricting voting.
Oh, I was just going to say, when you think about that for unhoused people as well, right, who have mobile, living locations and stuff, that also disenfranchises them.
Yes.
When I hear you, I'm starting to think we say voting rights are important, but people can't vote, so we're sending them to a doomed election because they won't be. So is it sufficient to say voting rights are important, or how can we make sure that the voting rights exist, but also that if they vote, they may change the situation?
Congress needs to reinstate the preclearance. The Supreme Court didn't negate that possibility when it struck it down. Congress can always pass a law to change the Voting Rights Act again to include the preclearance. The Supreme Court said the formula that they were using was outdated, so they could update the formula. And there have been bills to do this. So we'd really need Congress to get on board for this. But there are other laws that are just crazy, like Georgia trying to prohibit water from being distributed on long lines because Georgia closed polling locations in predominantly Black communities. So we're seeing it from the whole gamut of destroying voting.
And it's not just in the South. I think there's a tendency because historically in the South, when there were Jim Crow laws passed after Reconstruction, and then through the passage of the Voting Rights Act, in Ohio, there are many manifold restrictions on voting and in terms of voter ID laws being very enforced and other restrictions on voting and gerrymandering of districts that are also, that cause people to say, well, I don't have a voice in my district because it's, gerrymandered in such a way that they're never going to have their candidate win or their view represented in successful elections.
While we're focusing on some of the legal issues that have just been overturned, what's public health's responsibility? We started off by you really describing this aspect of the health consequences of these legal interventions that have occurred, particularly kind of since 2013. What should public health be doing? Besides telling every public health person to vote, what is a public health intervention in this regard?
Well, I think if those of us who are involved in public health education should be teaching the social determinants of health, not as this static flat pie, as the social determinants of health are influenced by the political determinants of health. Right. And so I know Daniel Dawes just came out with a new book called The Political Determinants of Health. We should be reading that book and reading other things and understanding and teaching our students how politics influence the social determinants of health.
Also bringing studies like the Rushovich study to policymakers. The Supreme Court has indicated that it doesn't actually care about social science research, but policymakers do. And that is a way to make a change. Even actually getting this type of research into the voices, if you know that Kenya, I think his name is Barris, used Blackish to promote public health research through the characters, which was unbelievably brilliant. A lot of it from American Journal of Public Health, but really getting this concept out. I start every class by saying, I don't think there's any issue that's not a public health issue. I start every class that way and let the students challenge it. And I think every issue, this is one of the pure issues, but people don't recognize it as such, as a public health issue. So kind of getting that concept out also into the public.
And also, I think people who work with CBOs, with community-based organizations, can be widening the conversation to be talking about, to the extent possible, voting rights and voting empowerment as part of and related to health interventions, right? So we've shown, Rushovich et al. Have shown that infant mortality is connected to voting rights. And so any large-scale strategy for reducing infant mortality has to, if possible, integrate this access to the franchise, but also to, political access and empowerment writ large.
And I think that's where understanding those mechanisms really comes back into with that education piece of understanding, well, it's not just voting. Well, I think it is important symbolically, right? And there is something to feel like your vote matters and that you have power over your life. It's also all those ways that voting then influences those policies and those social determinants. And I think there's also then other ways in which that people can feel that sense of control as well. And so I think when we're looking at voting as just one piece of this kind of puzzle of building power for the community and making changes in society that move towards health equity, we can also think about labor strikes and tenant organization and different things like that too, that also build a more collective power beyond just the individual, and then give people that ability to make their voices heard. Because we can see that unions are also able to then sway the vote in different ways that an individual can't do on their own.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's a key point in that discussion. And we've seen that the lack of community engagement, community participation, what we call bottom-up public health, has enormous implication. Personally, I think that a lot of the misinformation or the impact attributed to the media, social media, is related to the lack of engagement of community and their possibility to actually interact with the public health agencies and understand on both sides, what needs to be done, what are the causes, etc. So how do you relate voting rights to community engagement? I'm very curious to know that.
I love what you're saying, because grassroots movements tend to form around a topic like gun control or, the environment. There is, and then when you think of grassroots about political, it's about a party, right? Like the Democrats organizing in a local community. So how do we bring public health as for voting rights together as the grassroots topic? That's actually never been done, to my knowledge, right? That has to be the grassroots topic.
Well, except that I would step in, and I wish that Barbara Ransby were here. She wrote this amazing biography of Ella Baker, who is really the mother of the civil rights movement and is far less known than Martin Luther King and others. And she talked about how the community-based movements were basically, voting rights was one aim of this movement for civil rights movement by tenant farmers in the South who are fighting for healthier lives and better lives. Like, they weren't just, I think the revisionist history, which just drives me and most historians I know crazy, is this idea that they were just fighting for this abstract access to the ballot, this abstract legal right. But they were ordinary people like most people now who wanted better lives for their families. And as Ransby talks about, they wanted to have healthier conditions. The conditions that they were in were miserable. The franchise was instrumental in getting them basically, things like clean water, which now in Jackson, Mississippi, people are still fighting for. So, it's things can go backwards. It's not a uniform forward trajectory where some people in public health think it is. It's, now in Jackson, Mississippi and Flint, Michigan, and many other communities, people are fighting for clean water and for the basic services that would provide clean water. And so, I think those things are going on in community circles, in community activist organizations, community-based organizations. It's just that maybe within, official public health, those of us who were involved in academic or non-academic explicit public health organizations, we don't always recognize that as public health.
Yeah, let me just add to that, because it's almost like many of the movements that you've seen in minoritized communities, what you will see is that quite often it's a public health issue. So Cesar Chavez with the migrant workers, a lot of that had to do with, it wasn't just, well, pay me for my labor, but it's like the conditions of my labor are actually causing significant health problems. We saw it on the, for American Indians, particularly in the Southwest, and some of the mining conditions and how that has impacted health in terms of exposure to uranium and all this other stuff. So it's in tradition, we have made it, because it often looks like the goal is the legal changes, but the basis of it is often has been a public health issue. And I would say, Alfredo, one of the things that I hope that this particular podcast will do is to make this more than just the moment of their research, but the movement of public health finding its own history in terms of voting and helping people to really understand that voting is the enactment, but that the restriction of voting in terms of all the things that happen have significant public health implications. I'm going to give an example. When Obama was elected president, most people saw the joy in the African-American community of that election. But what they didn't see was how it highlighted that Black men who had been in prison could not engage in what became a very powerful message because of their incarcerated background linked to taking away their voting. So those of us that worked understood that there were interventions that were needed because these men felt left behind. They felt that they had no voice in what was so significant. And there was a bit of a anger, grief, upset that needed some interventions.
That's a great point, Vickie. I totally agree with it. But we have a few minutes that I want to, build on this point and a little bit, push our guests, because we had an editorial in the journal about the fascist threat, right? And we see some of the most extreme right side of the political panorama in the U.S. announcing terrible things for next year, whether they're elected or not, to the presidency. And this would mean, cutting voting rights, but a lot of other rights, etc. So the ACLU had a document about that. And if you see all the things that are expecting us, we won't be able to go in the streets. So what should we do before that in order to make sure that we do it while we can still do something? What type of community engagement? What's the role of public health in preparing for this election that also will prevent the most dire consequences of the election or the forced election of the former president?
Well, I think there are times where we're all just citizens, right? I mean, public health, people who work in public health are citizens. And I think just the role of citizens is to stand up against people who are trying to take away democracy. And I think this, to get back to the Rushovich et al. Article, I mean, it's illustrating the power of democracy in forwarding public health and putting forward health equity. And I think we can't take it for granted. We have to be involved. Democracy, preserving democracy is a key public health issue, whether you're doing this on your own time or if you're a state employee like I am. I can't be doing that, a lot of things on my work time, but I can certainly on my own time as a citizen. And I think that's just important.
But I think that one of the problems Alfredo just highlighted is the siloed media and the siloed information, because it's really hard to break through those silos at this point. We're in a different state than we were 10 years ago, where the misinformation campaigns are happening and people I don't see them. I hear about them from people who watch Fox News, frankly, but that's how I know about what's going on that side. But I would never know about it and vice versa. So I don't know how to break through that. I think that's a really big part of it. The information distribution is no longer a public good that we all share.
All right. I mean, Anna, if you want to have a final word, then I will conclude.
Yes. I think, again, going back to what Marian was saying of we are all citizens and trying to think about, regardless of who is elected, how do we move towards health equity? And I think a lot of that comes from organizing within our community and just thinking about how can we show up for one another during these times in which the structures that exist are not necessarily working for us, right? And so how do we enact mutual aid? How do we turn to the examples that Vickie was giving of Cesar Chavez or the Black Panthers, right? So many of their programs were grounded in public health and meeting the needs of the people because they weren't being met through the free breakfast program or the ambulance programs, right? And so I think regardless of the outcome of the election, we do have power as citizens outside of voting as well as through voting. And there's a lot of things that we can be doing to enact health equity and continue to build the world we want to see. And I think we just have to be a little more creative about it.
Thank you. Vickie, what my takeaway from this, and I would like to have your opinion on this, is what Marian said. I like very much this idea of defending democracy is a public health issue. And I think it's broader than the voting rights. It's defending democracy, and I think it's more adapted to where we are now politically. What do you think?
Oh, I would agree. I think that comment actually kind of just raises us up to really understanding. If you said, what can public health do? I think it's at this point in time, public health needs to be the voice of really the message of democracy is really a health issue as well. And that it's particularly not just a physical public health issue, but it is public health needs to be, kind of front and center. We got caught off guard, for example, and the economists helped us to see deaths of despair. But I think what we're going to see is despair if democracy isn't working for the people. And again, we know the consequences of despair. So public health has a place of elevating this issue all the way from working with communities to producing the research that challenges Congress to understand that their acts on voting have implications for the dollars that they see over there in our health budget, but that there is a connection.
Thank you, Vickie. That's great. And thank you all for your time and for your great work. And this is a conversation that we could have continued for an hour or more. And please send us your articles and send us your work. The journal will be very happy to publish it. So, Jennifer, Anna, Marian, my dear Vickie, thank you, and see you as soon as possible.
Thank you, Alfredo. Thank you, Vickie.